Good night, everybody. We're here in Colombo, Sri Lanka, and for the night of Ideas 2021, we are going to interview Sarah Kabir, the author of the book Voices of Peace. They were just like us, about reconciliation.
So good night, Sarah.
Hi.
Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Could you briefly explain the main stages of the civil war in Sri Lanka and how it ended for an international audience?
Sure. So if I was to explain the Civil War, I would go back to the root causes of the conflict, and for that you might have to go to colonial times. But I will fast forward and we will go to the 1950s. So in the 1950s, there was this very sort of divisive policy that was brought in that established Sinhalese as the official language in Sri Lanka. And there were two arguments that brought in this act. One was a post-colonial nationalist argument, and one was this social egalitarian argument to correct the historical injustices of the past, of the colonial time. But unfortunately, it led to the minorities feeling like the ethnic other. And so in the 1956, the Single-Only Act was passed. And from that point onwards in the 60s, I mean, things just kept getting worse. Well, in 58, actually, there was an anti-Tamil riot and increasing violence and tensions. And in the 60s, Tamils started to lose their jobs. They started to lose access to education. They started to lose even their identity because Tamil women were persecuted for wearing pottus. And then, I mean, by the late 70s, there was this targeted sort of increasing anti-Tamil rhetoric and riots that happened. 77, 300 people were killed in 77. In 81, there was the burning of Jaffna Library. And in 83 was Black July, which was the climax of the conflict. It sort of was the beginning of the war, let's say. So 83 to 2009, there was the all-out war. In between that time, we had spaces of peace, but it was quite short-lived. And 2006, there was sort of a final attempt at negotiating peace. But if I was to tell you the ending of the conflict, how it ended, 2004 was a main point where there was an eastern arm of the LTTE, which was led by Karuna Amman. They broke away, and that kind of led to a really weakening of the LTTE. And 2006 to 2009, we saw this war offensive, and by 2009, the government declared victory, and that was the end.
Okay. Yeah. And given the complexity of the war, you chose to address in your book Voices of Peace the issue through the power of narration. Could you briefly explain why you chose this approach?
Yeah. So narration, I think, so storytelling, narration is sort of a more recent tool that has been used for peace building and reconciliation. When I started the book, I started it in 2016 or so. And at that time, peace builders and activists, they had started collecting stories, but it was mostly of victims, which is important too. But also, I felt there was a gap in not listening to the voices of combatants, those who had, first-hand experience of the war, who were on the front lines. I felt that storytelling is a very powerful, sort of human-centric approach, where it's the best way to convey these stories of individuals who we think that we have nothing in common with. It was sort of the best way to humanize them, and it made us understand, I feel, that they are just like us, like the subtitle of the book.
And you also speak about the notion of negative peace. Could you elaborate a bit on this notion?
Yeah. So, I say Sri Lanka is in a state of negative peace because negative peace is the absence of overt violence, where weapons are laid down. But in the spectrum of peace, for Sri Lanka to move to a positive one, we have a long way to go. For a positive peace, ethnic relations need to be repaired, past grievances need to be addressed, but in Sri Lanka, I mean, we're still not in that sort of position. If I give you an example, just quite recently, there were nearly 50 youth who were arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act for a Facebook comment that was about a commemoration day that was associated with the LTTE. Today we also have this issue of forced cremations in Sri Lanka, where COVID-19 patients who are dying of COVID-19, families are forced to cremate the bodies of the dead, and this goes against particular faiths in Sri Lanka, and there is really no help, no scientific evidence. So right now, I mean, minorities, I think there's sort of in a vulnerable situation, minority rights really. Just to quote recently a politician in parliament, he made a statement saying, you know, minorities are fighting for their basic rights. They are going to courts for their basic rights. So Tamils have to go to court to remember their dead. Muslims have to go to court to bury their dead, and the cardinal is begging for justice for his dead. So I feel I'm not condoning violence in any way, but if we don't address the past grievances, and if we don't if we start to push communities into corners, we end up leaving them very vulnerable and easy to be manipulated by extreme forces. And this is the fear of being in a state of negative peace, because it's very easy to slide back into violence.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is the role of language barriers in this violence? Do you think, in terms of language barriers between the Tamil and Sinhalese, would you advocate for a mandatory teaching of Sinhalese and Tamil in public schools? Or
yes, I mean I would, because in Sri Lanka we're a really small country, and we live side by side of each other, but because of language and this issue of not being able to communicate with each other, we end up really being further and further away from one another. And I mean, I have to say we have great policies. The problem is in implementation. So secondary languages in schools are sort of taken very lightly here. I have an example. When I was in school, I studied in the Sinhalese medium, and I had to take Tamil until grade 5, and I remember during an exam, my paper was passed around the class by the teacher herself. So that's kind of how lightly, you know, secondary languages are taken in school. So until these are implemented properly, and informal education, including all 3 languages, you know, until that happens, we'll remain to be apart from each other, you know, unable to communicate and connect.
Okay. And do you think the financial empowerment also has a role to play, especially concerning the ex-LTTE?
Yeah, I would. I would say though, I would want to emphasize that it is not the only component though. Financial empowerment is important, but I think the government today somehow feels that economic or monetary compensation, development, the reconstruction of roads, that this is the only solution. But I feel, like I said, you know, until we have a space for memorialization of all sides, until past grievances are addressed, you know, we can't create a conducive space for reconciliation. But yeah, financial empowerment should be done, because the issue of lost land in the north is a big one. There are a lot of unemployed former LTT cadres still, and I know some of them are starting small electronic repair garages and shops and little agricultural plots, but not with the support or help of the government really. And this is something that, I mean, it's not just on the government. I think private sector could also get involved in creating employment opportunities. Yeah, I mean, this should be done, but as I said, it shouldn't be the only focus, and it's not the only solution for reconciliation.
Okay.
Yeah.
And speaking of collective memory that you mentioned, do you think that this process of collectivization has begun through recognition?
No, I mean, unfortunately, not the way it should be in Sri Lanka. To speak of the past, to speak of memorialization and things like that is seen as almost as deshadrohi, which is anti-nationalist or anti-Sri Lankan. That's what it means. If it isn't viewed as anti-nationalist, it's also sometimes implemented very much as a one-sided affair, where the powerful, you know, the victor it's a one-sided narrative that comes in. For example, if you take the particular commemoration day that I mentioned earlier, it's called Mavirarnal, and it is associated with remembering LTTE. But what happens is these sort of days get politically hijacked, and they get too often conflated with justifying or heroizing LTTE. But the reality is that there are, a mother or a father or a son or a daughter who just wants to remember their lost loved one. But unfortunately in Sri Lanka, there is no willingness or wanting to understand the past, to understand why the war began, why Sri Lankans were pushed to take up weapons, and there is no space for a collective memory that's being created. So unfortunately I feel like the fact that it's very much a one-sided affair it doesn't speak for what memorialization should be, and it doesn't really create a conducive space for all people who are engaged in the war.
And do you feel there are other ways that this could be an engagement, or that citizens could feel part of it? For instance, the role of sports and culture. Do you think is it a mean to reconciliation?
I think yes, sports and cultural programs are something that's quite often used in Sri Lanka. It's a great way of doing it, and I think it's also because it's less of a controversial, way of creating reconciliation, etc. But the problem is, now that it's been a decade or so, and with hindsight, we're able to evaluate the success of these programs, and they haven't been as successful as we would have liked it to. But I mean, there are these little programs that they bring Sinhalese boys from the south and Tamils from the north to play cricket together on a team, side by side, and that's great. And even recently we had a cricket tournament in Sri Lanka where the winners were the Jaffna Stallions, and majority of the players on this team are Sri Lankan Sinhalese. And one of the song for this team is called Jaffna Boys, and it's really nice to see the Sinhalese singing this song, and so it's great. But like I said, the thing is, sometimes though it can be just a plaster where we sort of it retracts from the deep divisions that exist, because we see these inter-ethnic teams and we sort of think everything is okay, but really the divisions are sometimes more deeper rooted, and seeing cricket teams together kind of blinds us from the deeper issues and how much more hard work needs to go into repairing and bridging those divides.
Okay, I see. And as for our last question, could you briefly speak about the role of religion also as well? I know it's central and it's a whole topic, but...
Yeah, religion and ethnicity, these are two things that have really, been causes for a lot of divide and pain and problems in Sri Lanka. But I think the problem is, in Sri Lanka we say that there are 4 main religions, and we say there is so it's Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Catholicism or Christianity, and there itself is the problem, because we group a whole group of individuals to be one and the same, but they're not, because there's a politics and plurality within the religions that gets forgotten. And really, most individuals, if you go across the country, you'll see everyone practices the religion in different ways. There's also a whole lot of other religions and beliefs in Sri Lanka, and there's also this issue in Sri Lanka where religion and ethnicity get confused, and they're used as this sort of weapon. Sometimes it's used to justify extremist or violent extremism. It is also used to justify racism towards an entire community, because it's very easy to use this umbrella, this religion, and group a whole load of individuals under this one group. But I personally believe religion can be a positive tool, because even though I say there are different religions, I believe we all practice the same core values of love, of tolerance, of humility, charity, and these are the main pillars of any religion. And I think whether you go to a mosque or a church or a temple, religion can bind us together as humans. But unfortunately, it's sort of misunderstood and misused in Sri Lanka and globally across the world. So it doesn't get used as a positive tool towards reconciliation.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much for all this explanation. And
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.